But this race politics is so toxic. I mean, it's a principle of the thing, this voice that really offends me. Because that kind of race politics inevitably turns into racism, and us against them struggle between races for power and for money. And that's happening not just here in Australia. In fact, in New Zealand, under its Labor government, it's even worse. Yet our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, loves what New Zealand is doing. He's even tweeted, "We can learn a lot from our mates across the ditch about reconciliation with First Nations people. New Zealand has led the way," he says. "It's time for Australia to follow." Well, what would we follow? The latest astonishing example that New Zealand has set us is to say that the 16% of New Zealanders who identify as Maori, they can get preferential medical treatment. Race there is now one of the factors hospitals must consider in deciding who to treat first. If you're Maori, you can get bumped up the queue for elective surgery. If you're of other races, white, Asian, whatever, you go to the back. Now, this racist policy already applies in Auckland and some councils, as the Health Minister proudly declared yesterday.
Aside from the Auckland district defined by the former DHB boundary, I am advised that Te Tai Tokerau district has implemented the tool for urology and orthopaedic waitlists, and Waitemata has recently implemented the tool in gynaecology.
Joining me is David Seymour. He's the leader of New Zealand's Libertarian ACT Party. He's himself got a Maori ancestry. David Seymour, thank you so much for joining us. What is this policy exactly?
The policy is called the Waitlist Equity Adjuster Tool, and the way it works is that when there are a series of people waiting for an operation in the New Zealand healthcare system, they are ordered according to a mathematical formula, and that takes into account a series of factors. One is pretty obvious: clinical need as judged by the doctors involved. Two is the amount of time they've been on the wait list, which seems even more obvious. That's how wait lists work. You're on it for a period of time, then you get to the front. Then there is your geographical location, which may seem odd, but somebody who lives in a major centre near a hospital will find it easier to get in for appointments and referrals and so on. So you can understand that to an extent. And then there's your deprivation index, or basically how wealthy or how poor you are. And you could argue about that, but most social services have some allowance for your means. So maybe you could understand that. The fifth criteria is, what is your ethnicity? And if you're Maori or Pacific Island descent, then you get more points and go up. If you're European, if you're Indian, if you're Chinese in your ethnicity, then you can go down. And the problem with it, of course, is that people can understand, people have different needs and they should be treated on a case-by-case basis. But when two people who are in the same circumstance get treated differently based on who their ancestors were, it's very unfair. It leads to a lot of resentment. And it also is inaccurate, because there may be people who are Maori or Pacific ancestry who are doing very well, thank you very much. And some people in that category are quite offended at the idea that they should be given extra points for being disadvantaged. But you may also not have that ancestry and nonetheless be in great need, and you miss out. So using ethnicity is a very blunt tool. It's very lazy, it's very divisive, and it's inaccurate.
So if you have you personally have the same medical condition as, say, your health minister, you with Maori ancestry, you go to the front of the queue and your health minister must wait, even though you've got exactly the same condition. Is that how it works?
Well, to an extent. I mean, you've got to remember it's a weighting system, so it's not absolute. It's just one of five factors. But one way to think of it might be one of our MPs in Parliament, one of ACT's MPs, Karen Chua, she made the point in Parliament that her husband is actually Cambodian. She is part Maori. They live under the same roof, in the same location, with the same household income. If they had the same clinical need and they'd been on the waiting list for the same amount of time, then she would go ahead of him because of their different backgrounds. And I think that is a good example of why people find this so distasteful.
Now, the Labor government says, well, this policy is needed because Maori people, they tend to wait longer for medical treatment. I'm not sure that's because they are Maori. I suspect there are other factors for that. Your response to that argument?
Well, we accept and we agree that as a statistical matter, people who are Maori or Pacific have worse health outcomes, have shorter life expectancy. That is true, but that ignores the underlying reasons why, which might be to do with living in poor housing that may be damp or mouldy can lead to respiratory illnesses, for example. We believe it's better to target the practical needs of each person, treating them as a human being, rather than lumping people into racial categories where the risk factors or the need may apply to some members of that group but not others. I mean, this is why we're opposed to racism, is because once you start treating a person based primarily on their race, you miss many other interesting facts about them, as well as creating resentment, because as soon as people know that they're going to be treated differently due to a characteristic they have no power to change, that is when people get very upset.
I think you'll find a lot more New Zealanders identifying as Maori in the next few years. David Seymour, thank you so much indeed for your time. It's extraordinary that this sort of racism now is official government policy. And this is the example that, the kind of example that our Prime Minister admires. Wait to see what comes out in Australia.